What Chuck Norris did when a judo champion challenged him in the locker room 3 seconds later, Long Beach, California, August 1969, a Saturday, 6:47 in the evening. The sun had dropped behind the convention center roof but hadn't surrendered yet. It smeared the sky outside in colors that had no business being that beautiful above a parking lot. Inside the Long Beach International Karate Championships, the overhead fluorescents had taken over, humming their flat, indifferent frequency over everything that mattered and everything that didn't. The air smelled of liniment, sweat, and the particular rubber and concrete smell that only arenas built for other purposes carry when they are temporarily repurposed for violence. The main event had finished 40 minutes earlier. The crowd was still filtering out through the lobby in clusters. Men in short sleeves discussing technique with their hands, women trying to locate their husbands, children reenacting what they'd seen with open palms aimed at each other's faces. The tournament floor was being broken down, the foam mats were being stacked, the scorekeepers had closed their notebooks, and in the corridor behind the main stage, through a door that required a badge to open, the world that spectators never see was in the process of dismantling itself. Chuck Norris had been competing in this tournament since the early part of the afternoon. He was 29 years old. In the broader martial arts world, the one that extended beyond Southern California and into the conversations that serious practitioners were having in gyms from Atlanta to Chicago, his name had begun to carry weight. He had won the All-American Karate Championship the previous year. He had placed in tournaments that 12 months prior he'd watched from the bleachers. He ran a chain of schools across the Los Angeles area, had students who were beginning to compete on their own, and had recently solidified a friendship with a man named Bruce Lee that would, in ways neither of them could yet articulate, change the direction of both their lives. None of that was visible in how he carried himself. He wore it lightly, or tried to. His Tang Soo Do master, Shinje Chol, had told him once that the man who is most aware of his own rank is usually the one who has earned it least. Norris had written nothing down. He didn't need to. He was standing at the sink in the men's locker room, his GI top already off, running cold water over his right forearm where he had absorbed a sweep in the semifinal that had left a bruise forming beneath the skin in the shape of something vaguely botanical. He was not thinking about the bruise. He was thinking about a sequence in his last match, a moment in the second minute where he had committed to a reverse punch and his opponent had read it a half step early. And the way Norris had recovered was adequate, but not what he would have wanted. Adequate recovery was something he worked to eliminate from his vocabulary of motion. He was still replaying it when the door opened. The man who came in was named Kenji Yamamoto. This is not his real name, but what follows is as real as memory and corroboration allow. He was a judo competitor, not a karate man, not a Tang Soo Do practitioner, not someone who operated within the framework of point fighting or kata. He was a grappler by training, by temperament, and by something that read as a kind of quiet contempt for the standing game. He was 32 years old, Japanese American, born in Sacramento to parents who had spent part of the Second World War in an internment camp, a biographical fact that had shaped him in ways he rarely discussed, and that his opponents, looking only at his physical bearing, consistently underestimated. He had competed in AAU Judo for 6 years. He had a gold medal from a national level tournament in 1967. He was not small. He stood just under 6 feet and moved with the compact, loaded quality of someone who had spent years learning to redirect mass rather than generate it. He was also, on this particular evening, in a bad mood for reasons that had nothing to do with Chuck Norris and everything to do with the judging panel that had scored his demonstration earlier in the afternoon, with a casualness he found insulting. He had come to the locker room to change, to leave, to go somewhere that was not this building. Instead, he found himself 3 feet from a man he recognized. There were 2 other men in the room. One was Danny Rios, a lightweight competitor from Van Nuys, who had come in third in his division and was sitting on a bench lacing his street shoes. The other was a cornerman named Gerald Park, who was folding towels and not paying much attention to anything. Neither of them was looking for anything to happen. Both of them would later describe what happened in terms that were remarkably consistent, given how quickly it unfolded. Yamamoto set his bag down on the bench along the far wall. He looked at Norris. Norris had not yet turned from the sink. "You're Norris," Yamamoto said. It wasn't a question. Norris turned off the water. He turned around. He looked at Yamamoto the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before he decides what it is, without hostility, without performance, with a quality of attention that some people find reassuring, and others find deeply unsettling. "Yeah," he said. Yamamoto studied him for a moment. Whatever he had come in here intending to do, change, leave, decompress, something had shifted. Later, when someone asked him about it, he would say that he hadn't planned anything, that it had come out of frustration looking for somewhere to go, that he respected Norris in the abstract, the way one athlete respects another's record. but that he had always believed the karate world was somewhat insulated from reality. That point fighting was an art of control, of stopping short, and that a man who had never been held, never been taken down, never felt the specific panic of having someone twice his leverage attempting to break his posture, was a man who was operating with an incomplete understanding of himself. He said something close to this, not so philosophically, more directly. "You're fast," he said, standing up. Norris said nothing. "I'm wondering," Yamamoto said, and there was something carefully neutral in his tone that was more provocative than aggression would have been. "What happens when you can't stand up?" Danny Rios stopped lacing his shoe. Gerald Park set down a towel. What most people who were not martial artists would have expected to happen next. An argument. A challenge accepted in hot blood. Something cinematic. What people who knew Chuck Norris slightly less than they should have might have expected. A demonstration of technical superiority. A lecture, an assertion of record and rank. What happened was this. Norris looked at Yamamoto for a moment that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Not a cold look, not a calculating one. More like a man reading weather. Then he walked over to the open space between the 2 rows of benches, maybe 8 feet wide, and stood in the middle of it. He stood without any particular stance. Feet roughly shoulder width, arms at his sides, weight centered. The posture of someone waiting for a bus. He said, "Okay." Yamamoto hadn't expected that. The word landed differently than he had prepared for. There was no invitation to posture in it, no warm-up, no negotiation. Just the single syllable and the man standing in the middle of the floor. Yamamoto set his bag down more carefully this time. He rolled his neck once. He moved toward Norris with the particular economy of a judo practitioner approaching a grip fight. Not rushing, feeling the space, looking for the lapel or the sleeve that would begin the conversation of balance and leverage. Norris's GI top was off. There was no lapel. Yamamoto would have to adjust. He reached for the left wrist. 3 seconds is a very short time for most things. It is a long time for what followed. Norris did not retreat from the grip. He turned into it. A rotation that any Tang Soo Do practitioner would recognize as the beginning of something, but that in this context became something else entirely. He had studied Judo in the Air Force. Not deeply, not to the level of a specialist, but enough to understand the grammar of what Yamamoto was attempting. The seizure of the wrist was the first syllable of a throw, a wheel, or a hip technique, something that required him to pull Norris off-center before the main action could begin. Norris gave him nothing to pull. He moved with the grip rather than against it, closed the distance faster than Yamamoto had calculated, and in the moment that the throw would have begun, it didn't begin, because Norris was no longer where the throw needed him to be. He had Yamamoto's right arm. He had the angle. He didn't use it. He stood there, holding the arm in a position that anyone who knew anything would recognize as controlling. Not a submission, not a break, but a position from which any of 3 or 4 things could have been initiated, none of them pleasant. He held it for exactly long enough for Yamamoto to feel it and understand it. Then he released it. He stepped back. He stood again in the posture of someone waiting for a bus. The room was quiet. Yamamoto straightened. He looked at Norris. Something had reorganized itself behind his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment exactly, but the particular internal adjustment that happens when a man realizes he has been shown something he didn't know he was about to be shown. Norris picked up his GI top from the bench. He began folding it. "You're right that I don't spend much time on the ground," he said. His tone was conversational, factual. "I should spend more." He paused. "Your grip entry was good. Fast." Yamamoto stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then he sat down on the bench and began to change his shoes. "Yeah," he said. That was all. Danny Rios finished lacing his own shoe and said nothing because there was nothing useful to add. Gerald Park resumed folding towels. The fluorescents hummed their single indifferent note over all of it. What had happened was not technically a fight. It was not a sparring session. It was not a demonstration. There was no winner in any formal sense, no concession, no score. What it was a conversation conducted in the only language both men fully trusted. The language of bodies in proximity, of weight and angle, and the willingness to be in danger without becoming something different because of it. Norris had not defended himself out of pride. He had not defeated Yamamoto to prove something. He had simply responded with the minimum necessary information and then stopped. The restraint was not performed. It was structural, built into the way he understood what his training was for. This is the thing that the martial arts world of 1969 was only beginning to work out, that the broader culture would take another 2 decades to partially understand, that the most dangerous thing about a man who has trained seriously for a decade is not his capacity for violence. It is his capacity for proportion. The untrained man hits as hard as he can and hopes. The trained man hits as hard as the situation requires, and no harder, because he has spent enough hours in enough gyms to know that exceeding the requirement is its own form of failure. A failure of reading, of judgment, of the thing that separates a martial artist from someone who simply knows how to hurt people. Norris had read the situation. He had responded to it. He had not escalated it beyond what it was. Tang Soo Do, as he had absorbed it from his time in Korea and from his subsequent study, was not simply a fighting system. It was a framework for understanding the relationship between force and purpose. The idea that technique divorced from wisdom is a liability. That power is only virtue when it is chosen rather than reflexive. His teacher in Korea, a man whose name he pronounced with a care that suggested respect accumulated over years, had told him in his second month of training that the worst student was not the one who couldn't learn the techniques. It was the one who learned them and immediately began looking for reasons to use them. Norris had carried that forward for 11 years at that point, through the Air Force and through his return to California and through the accumulation of wins and losses and the specific education that only comes from losing to someone better than you and returning to the gym the next morning anyway. He had lost matches. He would lose more. He had lost to Joe Louis, who was one of the finest competitors of their generation, a man who brought an athletic intelligence to karate competition that Norris genuinely admired and learned from even in the moments of defeat. He had lost in ways that stung not because of the loss, but because he could see after exactly what he had done wrong and exactly how long it would take to correct it. Loss, for him, was diagnostic. It told him where the structure had a gap. He built things into the gap. He came back. In the locker room at the Long Beach Convention Center on a Saturday evening in August 1969, none of this was visible as narrative or philosophy. It was simply behavior. A man standing in the middle of a room, making a choice about what was necessary and what wasn't, and then folding his GI. Kenji Yamamoto left the building 20 minutes later. He drove home to Torrance and didn't speak about the evening for several weeks. When he eventually did, to a training partner he trusted at a practice session on a Tuesday morning, he described it simply. He said he had reached for Norris and that Norris had not been there. He said this without self-pity. He said that what surprised him was not what Norris could do, but how little of it he had done. He spent a long time thinking about that distinction. It changed something in how he approached his own students, the way he talked about the moment after you gain control, the question of what you do with it. He competed for 3 more years at the national level. He retired from competition in 1972 to open a judo school in Gardena. He ran it for 27 years. Chuck Norris won the Professional Karate Association's middleweight title the following year and held world champion status for 6 consecutive years, retiring undefeated in 1974. He never discussed the locker room incident in any interview. There was no reason to. It hadn't been a story. It had been a moment, the kind that accumulates in a life not as legend, but as sediment, the material from which a person is quietly constructed over time, in rooms that no one writes about and that matter more than the ones they do. The fluorescence in that locker room hummed on after everyone had gone. The door swung shut on its pneumatic arm. Somewhere in the parking lot, an engine started. Long Beach, California, August 1969.